In the real world, when we go through our day, we have the feeling that time speeds up and slows, and this changes all the time, and this is something that is always fluctuating for us, and it can be a very effective simulation to try to create in our fiction writing. Now we can do this by guesstimating how long a period of time certain events take place in the story we're writing. So let's say that we're working on a time frame that happens in a 30-second time period. So our protagonist is riding on a train, and there are 3 tanks to the right of the train following along with it, and missiles fly through the sky and strike and blow up one tank, and a second missile strikes and blows up a second tank, and the third tank turns its gun or whatever it is to the train, fires, and blows up the car right next to the one our protagonist is in. The way I just described to you this series of events took about 30 seconds for me to describe. So if I were to write it down word for word, that prose style would be very much in time. And the way I did that was to extremely limit the detail, extremely limit the description. The prose are stripped of all internal thoughts and reflections and planning from the protagonist, and what the weather is like and what the decal on the tank says, and that's all taken down, and the everything that happens seems to happen very quickly. One of the number one rules for this type of strategy in writing is you never describe how quickly or slowly things happen, but you give that effect through the style of writing. So instead of saying the tank suddenly or the missile suddenly came out of the sky, just say the missile flew through the sky and hit the tank. Now that is going to appear sudden to the reader because you just say it. Let's say you're describing the protagonist counting the tanks, and then you say a missile flies across the sky and blows up the tank in the back. That is going to feel like it suddenly happened, but to say that it suddenly happened, you're actually giving the sensation of slowing the reading down at the same time that you're saying it suddenly or quickly. If you want to slow things down, you can say the landscape fell out of focus as the protagonist grows dizzy. The protagonist happens to look up in the sky as a missile makes its way. The protagonist follows to where he expects it to land and sees the tank in the back and watches as his expectations are fulfilled. So I've effectively slowed time down through that description. Now, all different sensations of time are effective in writing, and it's always a good time to vary, to have events in your fiction that seem to happen really quickly and go by, and other times where it's more languorous and the time seems to be still and it seems to be more meditative, and there's more of a dwelling in time quality to the writing, and all in between. You can have it go gradually from slow to fast, or you have a very slow time pace where there's a lot of detail and there's a lot of inner monologue. And then if you start firing off rapid event after event after event, it gives a great sensation of things happen suddenly, and there's a great upheaval of time speed shift. As an exercise, pay attention to how this quality in your own life. Pay attention to when time is slower. That is when we have a chance to bring in more detail, to bring in more information about the surrounding, to do character development, to really decorate our fictional world and flesh it out and make it more real seeming by furnishing our fictional world. In a lot of action scenes you don't want to do that because you want to give a sense that things are happening too quickly to think about them. But also there's an effect that when people are in like say if they're in a car crash, time slows way down because our brains switch into this mode where we become like hyper recorders and we record everything. And this is something you'll see it in film a lot, and there's science studies of this, the way it really appears like there's a time slow. And you can, like in the movie The Matrix. And the reason this is such an effective use of time simulation is because we recognize that. We recognize that when there is a time slow, it's actually, ironically, during the most fast, traumatic emergency. You would think that with a time slow it would make it seem not like an emergency, when in fact it can make it seem that much more like an emergency. So in your writing you can have the monster emerges from the night, and you can count, the protagonist can count the teeth on the monster, and can all these details, can count the whiskers on the front of the monster's nose, and taste a little bit of dirt that, just minute detail. If you go into this sort of tunnel vision, minute, every single detail, varying the speed, the time sense in the story is essential. It won't be effective if you're always writing in rapid fire time. You won't get this effect if time is always slowed down by filling everything in all the time. But if you're varying it, then you can convey the sense. You can convey the sense of suddenness. You can convey the sense of rest. So if you want to write with rapid timing, then the details, the descriptions, the inner dialogue, and even the dialogue, the filling in of what happens in each event, choose the ones that most greatly describe the most about the scene. You can still have one or two details filled in, but choose the most effective ones and the most necessary ones. In fiction, time sense is really tied into how quickly the plot is moving along. So you can have a lot of activity, you can have a lot happening, but if the plot isn't undergoing many transformations, it can still seem to happen slowly. This is one of those kinds of ability of writing where it really backs up the idea that the best writing is invisible. When we forget that we're reading when we forget that we're reading a story, that is when we are 100% tuned into the story, 100% captivated as the audience, and 100% carried away. And this is not at all limited to action genre. Think about, like, say there's a story about nurses in a cafeteria and how you can use the time effect. You could have the first part of the story written from one nurse's point of view, where everything is taking place very slowly, so it's all meticulous, and everything seems to take too long, and it's dragged out with all these incidental things that happen, and paying attention to how her ear itches, and then, on the next page you could switch to another nurse's point of view where this happened, I need to do this, and I'm going to go here, and it only takes 2 paragraphs, and the same scene takes place in a totally different virtual time. Now I know when my first attempts of writing, I sort of had this feeling that you start out a story by introducing the location and the characters, and it's all a lot of describing what that location is like and the different, what each character is like. But that attitude can be extremely limiting in that if if you save those descriptions for slow periods of your story, so you can you don't have to introduce all of the location. Okay, it is good to orient your reader a little bit at first, just to let them know where they are. They don't have to learn all of it at once. By parsing out when you do the fill-in stuff, when you want to have time slow down. This is also a time when the reader can get to know the characters and the location a little bit better and be surprised by some of the new things they learn. So let's say that we have two characters that are going on an adventure, and they're needing to do one or two things in a state of an emergency before they make an escape, and that part of the story is written to be read much more quickly, focusing more on plot and action. But then they escape into the woods, and we want to change the time sense for this. So then we could have a dialogue going, and we could have them talking as if they've been yammering back and forth for days, and they could go on for days more. We could have it a real Waiting for Godot type of time sense. I've described to you basically that you can speed up and slow down the sense of time in your fiction, but the time sense in your fiction can have a real distinct personality. You can have it fitted to your story to where it isn't just a matter of whether time is going slowly or quickly. You can also, as the example I just gave it a feeling like, oh, now they're in a place where they don't have to worry as much about time, so the prose can be described in a way as if it isn't being driven by a plot. If you leave yourself open to the possibility that you may discover new senses of time in your fiction, or at least make the time sense very, very distinct to the story you're writing, then you're allowing yourself the possibility of making those creative discoveries. Let's say that you're working on a part of a story where the protagonist is searching for their keys and can't find them. So the time sense here is a sense of rush, and in this time sense the actions are described, they happen as they're described. The protagonist does this, the protagonist goes here, the protagonist does this, the protagonist goes here. And each time what happens slows the prose down. The keys aren't found. These other things are found. Things that aren't needed right now, that aren't wanted. So you have a mix-up between actions rapidly done and a few details here and there of how the wanted result is not found. And that can be a very distinct time sense. So as an exercise, write a one-pager of a protagonist in a rushed situation. How fast can you make time go? A story that takes place over 100 years can be told in 2 minutes. So if you want to make time go very quickly, you can switch into very much overview mode. Think of at the beginning of a lot of stories, they sort of give the backstory. So they talk about, and then this rising dynasty did this to this other country, and so they're talking about events that take place over a great period of time, and they're telling it very quickly. Somewhere in between that, somewhere in between spending pages and pages and pages on something that occupies a 1 minute period of time and 2 paragraphs that describe what happened over the last 2,000 years, there's a lot of variation. So in horror movies, there's one technique that they use that is the time stop technique. So right before the monster strikes, the cameras are running and all the characters don't do anything. They're just waiting, and they'll hold that like that for a few seconds. So as an exercise, write a time stop. What will your words say? What descriptions will you have? Will you have, you know, if you're working on a scene where there are 3 characters, how are you going to draw out in an interesting way and basically describe a scene where nothing is happening right after every character in that scene is expecting the monster to strike at any moment. As an exercise, write a 2-pager where you're doing a great contrast between 2 time senses. So you have it go back and forth, let's say twice. And so you write one part of it where all these armies are doing this, and these governments and these protesters, and you know, it's happening over dozens of years. And then you jump right into where a protagonist is wandering through a field, picking flowers, finding, you know, insects on the ground, just enjoying the afternoon. And then you switch back to these battleships are being blown by the storm, and a whole people went through the potato, you know, lots of activity. And then you switch back to sitting down in the grass, looking up at the leaves in the sky. And so do an exercise where you try to create the most contrast between 2 separate parts of the story. Remember, the only should with this technique is variance. If you're always moving the plot along, that can get kind of tiresome after a while. If there's all this activity, but the plot isn't moving along very quickly all the time, that can get kind of tiresome. You can increase the feeling of these changes in plot if you have a slow period before that. So it's always good to vary the flow of your story in this way and contrast it. You have slow parts, and then that'll make the fast parts seem faster, and have fast parts, and that'll make the viewer enjoy the slow parts more, and it'll be they can enjoy it the way a person enjoys the day off when they can relax and kick back. So if you're a writer who likes to write this very fast-paced, action-filled stories, one of the best things you can do is write some very slowed down prose, and because this would be just the way that you could add that much more excitement to the action-packed parts of your stories, is to have some parts in there that go more slowly, so that you have something to play off of, so that when the rapid action-changing scenes happen, they feel that way. I hope that was helpful. The reason I make these videos is to get the word out about my story project at solomation.com. And if you like these tutorials, please take the time to go check it out. My episodes are there for free. Also, please hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment. I hope your writing goes great, and have a good day.